continue to think about performance in this module. If we compare what we're learning to your work as a student, we can think of the performance determinants from the last module as the knowledge, skills, and abilities you need to succeed in the class. In many cases, an instructor uses a process somewhat like a job analysis to create the class. The syllabus and assignment sheets are different parts of the job description. What we'll learn in this module about performance measurement is like the grading process. Just like there are usually at least a few different assignments and exams that are used to determine your grade in a class, there are a few ways we can collect data and different types of data we can collect about performance. Like job analysis, this is another process that has some parallels to what we learned about research. Hands-on measures are when an employee actually does the task they need to perform for the job, usually in a simulated setting. It's a little tricky to think of examples of this from some classes, but it's a little like doing math problems to demonstrate your understanding of math. Electronic performance monitoring is pretty much what it sounds like, using technology to monitor work. It seems like this has gotten a lot more common in recent years as technology has become more sophisticated. As a student, this would be like if a faculty member used time in the course site to determine a participation score. Rating formats of measurement are much more common, in part because they tend to be less expensive to develop. If we shift perspectives a bit, you're probably familiar with at least one example of a performance rating system: the end of semester teaching evaluations. In work settings, we can measure performance using at least 3 different types of data. Objective measures are things like the number of units produced or the number of customers served. Personnel data includes the information that would be stored in an employee's personnel file, like number of days missed or late for work. Judgmental data is the impressions of others. If we compare that to your work as a student, objective data would be like a multiple choice test with right and wrong answers. Personnel data would be like basing a portion of the grade on attendance, and judgmental data would be scores on open-ended questions or papers. Thinking about it that way, then, it might not be much of a surprise that the 3 sources tend to give different perspectives on performance. The results don't tend to be consistently correlated. The discussion for this module will help you think about the factors that influence performance ratings other than performance, but they can be generally grouped into 3 categories: politics, the rating scale, and the rating process. The textbook discusses the motivations and goals of raters, both of which represent the politics that influence performance rating. The article with this module is summarized in the textbook and gives some vivid examples. In many cases, though, the influences are much less personal. The scale and process of ratings can each introduce problems that influence performance ratings, but have nothing to do with performance. When we think about the rating scale itself, we need to ask 3 questions. To what extent is the characteristic being measured behaviorally? To what extent is the meaning of the response category defined? And to what degree can the person interpreting the ratings understand what response was intended? The first question can be addressed by using actual specific behaviors that are included in the job. When they're included in a checklist format, the person responding selects multiple examples of the employee's behaviors. Depending on the instructions, they might select all that apply or the most frequent. Either way, it's pretty clear what the rater is thinking about and what it means when the rater selects set options. So behavior checklist is a strong option when we think about it in terms of the second and third questions. Behavior can also be used with graphic rating scales and some of the other formats discussed in the text. One way to select the behaviors to use for ratings is by using examples of behavior that represent performance on critical incidents that were defined in the job analysis. Remember that we're using critical to mean essential in this case, so the idea is that the job analysis identifies essential behaviors, and during the performance rating process, someone rates the degree to which the employee demonstrated those behaviors. The rating process might include having multiple people rate an employee's performance. When those raters represent all of the possible perspectives on the job, it's called a 360 model. Your book talks about that process in more detail, including some limitations. Even when there's only one person completing the ratings, and they aren't influenced by politics, their responses might be consciously or unconsciously display patterns referred to as a central tendency error, leniency severity error, and the halo error. Central tendency and leniency severity patterns are pretty self-explanatory, but the halo is a little less intuitive. It's different than leniency. It's not a halo as in they perform like an angel. which would be more of a leniency error. It's where the rater gives the same ratings on different dimensions for one reason or another. We can think about the consequences of the performance measurement or evaluation process from two perspectives. One is whether the employee keeps their job, and the second is the psychological impact. Performance data is often used to make decisions about an employee's future, including whether or not they stay with the organization. On a person-by-person basis, performance data can be used to justify terminating individual employees, and it's often necessary to avoid legal complications. When an organization needs to downsize or reduce the number of employees through layoffs, performance data can help managers decide who to keep. Promotions and other administrative decisions are also often based on performance data, though you might remember the Peter Principle and keep in mind performance in the current job should probably not be the only criteria for promotion. Similarly, there are some concerns about connecting decisions about pay and raises solely to performance. The psychological impact of performance measurement is frequently the result of the feedback. In some cases, performance can reduce uncertainty and provide validation, or be valuable for helping an individual know what they can do to improve. In other cases, though, feedback can be destructive. The fact that cruel and sarcastic feedback can be destructive is probably pretty straightforward. It might be a little less obvious, though, that general and personal feedback can be destructive. When you think about it, though, it probably makes sense. General feedback doesn't help a person know what they need to change or what to keep doing, and personal feedback isn't related to the job. The book mentions that destructive feedback tends to follow an accumulation of performance problems and talks about how to repair the damage, which suggests that destructive feedback is not necessarily deliberate or intentional as much as an emotional outburst. That said, giving helpful feedback can be something of an art. One model suggests identifying themes. For example, if ratings related to work with others in numerous contexts were low, then we might talk about a theme of communication or something along those lines. You might be familiar with the recommendation that feedback about weaknesses be sandwiched between comments about strengths, but that can actually result in less attention to the positive. That said, a person can also only take so much negative feedback, so it might be preferable to identify a few weaknesses that are really important. When presenting feedback, it's also important to explain it in terms of behavior. A good tip for feedback in many settings, not just work. Behavior-based feedback has a few benefits. It's easier to determine what a person needs to change. It can also help the person receiving feedback see the situation as something they can control. For example, if I look at my husband and say, "You're really a jerk sometimes," he has no idea what to do to change my view, and it probably feels a little personal. If, however, I say, "It's really frustrating for me when you finish the ice cream without asking if I wanted any," he knows what he can do differently. He even has a few options, since he could ask, or he could just make sure we have plenty of ice cream on hand. My examples strayed a bit from the initial thought that these ideas parallel what you experience as a student, but hopefully that didn't distract from the main ideas. If we come back to the question of how performance measurements should be done, we can bring the ideas together. Performance measurement should be done in a way that emphasizes an individual's behavior, using approaches that encourage accurate ratings that can be interpreted in a way that provides the employee with meaningful feedback. That requires a deliberately constructed rating scale or another method of data collection designed with similar intention, as well as evaluators who are aware of the implications of the process.